Hello, welcome to the third part of my series on Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West. This is the first installment where we'll get into the body of the book, so we'll begin with part one of the introduction. And the first sentence of this book tells us that this is the first attempt to predetermine history. And, I didn't think much of that the first couple times I came through the book. I thought it was very interesting. But I didn't look at it in much of a critical sense, and I actually don't think it's true whatsoever that this is the first attempt to predetermine history. Just as a practical matter, I think fortune tellers and, people with stock picks and people with gambling picks and sports picks, all this. People have been trying to predict history forever. But even on a more formal level, just within Germany, in the last 100 years before Oswald Spengler's time, you have Hegel and Marx, who both have philosophies, so-called, that tell us about kind of an eschatology of the world, kind of the end of the world, what's going to be the end state of the world. In Hegel's conception, basically the state becomes God. This dialectic process leads the state to realize itself as God on earth, and he actually speaks about this end state for the state as if it is God. He uses the terms that somebody like St. Thomas Aquinas would use to speak about God as an absolute unmoved mover. And so that's the end that he thought that history was leading to. And, he thought that was a predeterminate end. So it's kind of strange that Spengler is saying that his is the first attempt ever. And it's just bizarre also that Hegel could honestly say that the state could become an unmoved mover. Like literally the state would not be an effect of any other cause and would cause every other effect. And that is so contrary to life that it's honestly bizarre that anybody has ever taken this guy's thoughts seriously. And then there's Marx, on the other hand, and he's got all his phases through which history goes according to his, quote-unquote dialectical materialism, because he's taken this dialectical idealism of Hegel and turned it on its head. But so he also thinks he knows what the eschaton will be. He knows that it will be this utopian dictatorship of the proletariat, and everyone's going to be equal and all of that. So we have had attempts to predetermine history very shortly before Spengler, but in the first two paragraphs, he's basically, maybe he's just talking his book, we could say. He's just trying to get the reader interested in the book. That's the most charitable way to look at this. And, to the extent it's just a rhetorical flourish, okay, you want to get the reader's attention. But there's absolutely, there's no truth to this as a proposition. And now also trying to look at it in another charitable light, we could say, well, maybe this relies entirely on his unique definition of history. Nobody else has really tried to predetermine history in Spengler's unique sense of the term. Because Marx and Hegel, those would have been linear histories, right? They view it as going through these phases to this final state, whereas his is a cyclical view. So he views each culture, these 9 cultures that he posits, he views each of them as going through a life cycle that he analogizes to spring, summer, autumn, and winter. And so maybe his is the first to try to predetermine history if we put history in quote marks, and it's only his definition of history. And the other thing about his that's different is it's relativistic. So in one sense, it's analogical when we look at the cyclical part, because he'll look at each of these cultures in their spring phase, in their summer phase, and draw analogies between them, because he believes that certain characteristics come out in each phase of a culture. But on the other hand, it's deeply relativistic, and I say almost apophatic in the theological sense. So this idea that God is apophatic is I think mostly associated with Neoplatonism and some forms of Christianity, and certainly some forms of Islam as well. But the idea is that God is so different from our mortal coil, we could say, that we can't actually say anything concrete about God. We can only say things in a negative sense based on our lack of knowledge of God, basically. And he kind of believes this between cultures, that no one from one culture can really understand the soul of another culture. So there's this deeply relativistic aspect and cyclical aspect to his view of culture. And then he views history as only taking place within these high cultures, as he calls them. So maybe you can say charitably, his is the first attempt to predetermine history, in quotation marks, his form of history. But we've seen many Germans attempt this very shortly before Oswald Spengler in the greater scheme of things. So it's somewhat bizarre that we get a blatant falsehood in the very first paragraph. And then the other thing he says is that he's focusing on the Western culture because it's the one culture in its state of fulfillment at this point in time. And so by fulfillment, he means it's kind of coming into its end, its kind of perfected state, you could say, from like a classical Greek perspective. And that I thought was kind of interesting on a reread, because he does view the Russian culture as being this younger culture, probably in its spring, not really even in its summer yet, I don't believe. And so why isn't this in some stage of fulfillment? Well, I think it's because he means fulfillment to mean very close to a completion. And so the Russian culture is still in its youth, so to speak, and there's still a lot of possibilities still open for it, because this lifetime of a culture's life, or this analogy of the lifetime of a culture to a human lifetime, is very central to Spengler's thinking. So when you're 20 years old, so many more possibilities are open to you. They haven't been fulfilled yet. And so it's more difficult to predict the course of your life than if you're already 60, 70, 80. Your life has already been fulfilled in this kind of Spenglerian sense, and it's much, much easier to predict the rest of your life course because mortality will be coming for you relatively shortly in this kind of macabre perspective on the world. And so that's the first point. The second point is he starts to talk about the logic of history and the metaphysical structure of history in the third paragraph. And this is pretty interesting because the third and fourth paragraphs of this book are just long sequences or long connections of rhetorical questions, about 6 or 7, and some of them very long sentences. And he's just kind of presenting all the questions that will occupy the work, but many of them are actually just going to be presuppositions of the work at the end of the day. He doesn't really prove a lot of these, but he's setting them up with these questions here, very similar to how you would in a legal brief. So, for instance, if you had a brief in front of the Supreme Court of the United States, the first thing that you would put is the question or questions presented. And you're going to try to frame these questions in the way that's the most favorable for your side. And that's basically what he's doing here. And so I just thought that was very interesting. So he sets out these lists of rhetorical questions, and it's about the logic of history and the metaphysical structure of humanity. Now, metaphysics, I mean, that's tough for like modern English speakers. We don't usually like metaphysics. I remember being in high school in biology class, and my teacher, in that kind of impish way that so many biologists have, was like, yeah, if someone ever mentions metaphysics to you, ask them to define that term. What do you really mean by that? Why he's talking about this in biology class is another question, but that's just always stuck with me. Now, I take metaphysics much more seriously now than I did when I was 16, but yeah, so that's what he's looking for, is the metaphysical structure of history. And he thinks that this is essentially independent of the outward forms of humanity. Again, this is all phrased as rhetorical questions, but really, these are these are the propositions that the book is founded on. So the form, again, the way the title has been translated by Charles Francis Atkinson for Volume 1 is as form and actuality. Now, we'll speak a little bit more about whether we think that's the best translation, because it probably isn't. But what is this trying to say to the English-speaking audience of the 1920s? Maybe that is an interesting question. But so these rhetorical questions go on. Actuality is derived from that something, and that something would be the logic of history and the metaphysical structure of history, or metaphysical structure of historic humanity. So we'll get into that more with this book. And then, are there certain grand traits of world history? This is what really interests him, these analogies between the great cultures. And many of them are very interesting, and we'll get into those over the course of the book. And then finally, what are the limits to such reasoning? And the limits to this reasoning, this ties into his nature-history dichotomy, which he'll get into more and more in the early chapters of this volume. But, so those would be the limits to the reasoning. He believes within the history part of this dichotomy, you need to use this analogical, morphological approach that's trying to get at the interior logic, in quotation marks, of history and the metaphysical structure of historic humanity. And then on the other side of that dichotomy would be nature thinking, systematic thinking, how you would study physics, chemistry, things like that. So he's really trying to set himself up in opposition to those sorts of studies, or the manner that a Darwinist would go about biological studies. So that brings us to the third point. He says human history is the sum of mighty life courses, and ego and personality are given to these mighty life courses by predicating high cultures. So these high cultures, here he kind of recognizes that they're artificial, so he's just predicating them. They give ego and personality to the sum of mighty life courses. So, what exactly that means is some question, but he says by predicating, or is he postulating them? Basically, these high cultures are assumed to exist in order to give ego and personality to these mighty life courses. But does he ever really give us a great reason to make this assumption? I'm not so convinced after in this rereading. I'm not tremendously convinced of that, but there's a central assumption for the book that these mighty life courses have this ego and personality as a high culture. On to the fourth point, he talks about birth, death, youth, age as fundamentals of organic life. And that's true, and this really informs his analogical approach, because he's going to say, because these high cultures are organisms within his conception, they must have a death, and that's going to give them a lifespan, a predictable lifespan, so he can say what their destiny is. Because Western culture is very old in his conception and is moving into the civilization phase, he can say with much higher confidence what's going to happen with it than he could about the Russian culture, for instance, which he posits as a young culture. But he includes America, here's just an interesting tangent, is he includes America 100% within Western culture, but he doesn't include Russian culture whatsoever. These are completely discrete from each other, and there's a deep gulf of knowledge between these people, almost like this apophatic abyss between these people. But it's just funny because Russian culture would have developed much closer to European culture for a much longer span of time. American culture, develops out of mostly English culture, other areas of the British Isles, southern Germany, a big area that sent many immigrants to the United States. So So you've got that, and then we have a constitution that's radically different than any other constitution, but he wouldn't view that as very important because it's not a religious idea, so it doesn't have the life force. He views Russian culture as having this life force because he really likes the religious ideas of Dostoevsky. I think that's a very central data point for him in positing this unique Russian culture, whereas he doesn't think American culture is unique. But he's also got this weird insistence on the land being very important for people, and he thinks that American, races from different areas of Europe start to take on this American appearance, this American physiognomy, which is so important for him, physiognomic tact, as John David Ebert would put it. So he even thinks they take on characteristics of this unique soil in America, but they're not their own culture, even though they start to look like the Native Americans, because he's got this kind of like terroir view of the soil, the way a French vintner would view his terroir. That's how Spengler views the soil to a certain degree. So that's kind of strange. And then the other thing that's important to think about there is he working with an equivocation on the word organic here? Because are incorporeal, quote-unquote, organic objects the same as a true organic object? So organic should mean carbon-based. That's the true rock-solid definition of organic, as in organic chemistry, the very difficult class that kind of separates who's going to actually be a chemist or a biochemist from who just thought they wanted to do that major. And so are these things really organic? Are these ideas really organic in this broader sense? Because certainly they're not carbon-based. As far as we know, they're completely incorporeal outside of them being represented in the substrate of our brains to some degree, to the extent that they are. And for instance, one thing is the Lindy effect, something that Nassim Nicholas Taleb named. Basically, if something has been around, something incorporeal that's a human idea, for instance, the Bible, has been around, more than 2,000 years, we should expect it to be around for another more than 2,000 years. It's just a rule of thumb, a heuristic. So the longer a book has been around, the longer you would expect it to be around in the future, and the shorter. So you see, all these books or songs that come out in any given year, they're most of them forgotten. But one that lasts for just a little bit of amount of time, that's going to give you more confidence that to predict that it will last in the future. So these incorporeal, objects, speaking very broadly, do they actually behave the same way that a corporeal, organic object would? This idea doesn't interest Spengler in the least. He doesn't test that notion whatsoever. And, he even kind of poo-poos or dismisses it, because at that time there were a lot of people interested in studying Proto-Indo-European, and they would use the same morphological approach that Spengler uses to study his cultures. But they would use it more rigorously because they're actually using it on words that are related to each other. Because Spengler posits that these cultures are completely unrelated to each other on a fundamental metaphysical level. But if you're actually doing a proper morphology, if you're doing proper genetic studies, you have to have a common ancestor to look from to make any inferences, and you've got to understand how these things would evolve from that common ancestor, or have some framework for testing your hypotheses. So I bring it back to Proto-Indo-European there, because this was a big project. It starts in the late 18th century. A Welsh barrister by the name of William Jones is sent to Calcutta to help the British East India Company manage their Indian possessions as a judge on the Supreme Court of Bengal, because he's a great linguist as well as a great lawyer. So he's an expert in Persian languages. He's also got a very good Greek and Latin background, as any good Englishman of the time would. And he's studying Sanskrit so that he can verify that the Pandits, where we get our word pundit from, are actually telling the truth about the laws that they claim to exist, basically. So he studies Sanskrit, and within a few years he realizes that it's too closely related to Greek and to Latin for this to be a random chance. So this sets, this is an intellectual sensation in Europe, and it sets many Germans, many Englishmen, but, Germans primarily, on this task of trying to understand who the Proto-Indo-Europeans were and trying to identify this language. So the important thing for our purposes is not this very interesting pursuit of the Proto-Indo-Europeans through archaeological and linguistic means. Philology was the traditional term for this, but more historical linguistics today. If you'd like to look into the matter more, I highly suggest David W. Anthony's book, The Horse, the Wheel, and Language. Anyway, Proto-Indo-European, the historical linguistic quest, could only still exist because Proto-Indo-European had those descendant languages that still exist today. So because it's an incorporeal, quote-unquote, organic object or life force or whatever it may be. Now Spengler wouldn't view it that way because there's no religious idea behind it. He views the religious idea as being the really giving the strength to the prime symbol of any culture. But with Proto-Indo-European, it doesn't have a definite lifespan because, the language itself does die after, 1,000 or 2,000 years, but it has all these descendants and they go on living. So why wouldn't we think that these cultures eventually would have descendants or that, something else would happen with them? It's just the idea that they have a lifespan when all these other memetic forms, memetic in the sense of Richard Dawkins, The Selfish Gene, one of the last chapters, if not the last chapter of that book, I forget, is about memes in this broad sense of, he posits it as the idea of a, kind of a genetic unit of an idea that will be passed down and that will try to replicate itself. And he might owe a debt to Spengler there to some degree because his idea seems to build off of Spengler's in kind of more of the rigorous way, and not that Dawkins' conception of it was particularly rigorous, and certainly Dawkins didn't try to get to the bottom of his meme idea with any rigor. He throws it out in 1976. It's very interesting. He writes The Extended Phenotype a few years later, which does kind of build up on the ideas a little bit. But then after that, everything he's doing after that is just anti-Christian polemics, basically. The blind watchmakers may be, decent, but that, you've got the God delusion and all this stuff, and he's really wasting his time just trying to dunk on Christians rather than actually looking into the meme idea. But that's a matter for another day. Anyway, it's just, can we really say that because there's some organic sense to the fundamental ideas of a culture, that the culture itself has a lifespan, or that is the best way to look at a culture? I'm not perfectly convinced about that. And I think the research from, things like Memetics, things like Proto-Indo-European Studies, suggests very strongly that ideas do not have a lifespan in the same way that organisms do. And so that's a big difficulty for Spengler's project, I believe. On to my fifth point. So he does mention that he thinks, or he poses the question, we're still in that fourth paragraph where he's still on his rhetorical questions. And he says, is all history founded upon general biographic archetypes? And this was just interesting to me because he doesn't mention archetypes very much throughout the book. Or at least Atkinson in translating it doesn't mention them much. But, general biographic archetypes, it just has a lot of Jungian sound to it. And he does like to use some of these psychoanalytical words. The biggest example is in Volume 2. He kind of develops this totem and taboo dichotomy, which Freud developed in a 1913 book. And yeah, I didn't find that quite convincing, but it's... Anyway, that's more of a tangent than anything. On to the sixth point. So he says, decline of the West is a philosophical problem that includes within itself every great question of being. I actually really like this, the way he says this, because in one sense it's kind of grandiose. Like, your philosophical problem about the decline of the West includes within itself every great question of being. Like, that's, but at the same time, I've felt that way about many legal cases. Sometimes a great case really will contain within itself so many fundamental problems, so many great questions within that legal system that need to be fleshed out. So, maybe he is right here. Now on to 7, he says, to predict the destiny of Western culture, and destiny is a very important word with Spengler, we must first be clear as to what culture is, and he italicizing the is, and that's kind of interesting that's italicized. I mean, who knows what Atkinson's going for here? Or how Spengler would have emphasized this in the original German. I'd be interested to know. Because in one sense, he's emphasizing kind of the becoming of the culture. But in another, he's kind of emphasizing the being of the culture, and this becoming is a big distinction for Spengler, as for so many German philosophers. Because he believes the culture as it's becoming is alive, it's got life force, but the civilization as thing become, as the fulfillment of the culture, is dead. It's a thing become. It no longer has life force for him. The other thing that's very interesting is he's saying to predict the destiny of Western culture, he must first be clear as to what culture is. First be clear as to what culture is. That sounds like a definition to me, right? He needs to define culture. But as we saw in the preface that he wrote in 1922, after he's had years to reflect on this project, he says, those who define do not know destiny. And I wonder if that's kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing, where he's almost laughing at himself because he defines terms throughout. Now, maybe he doesn't define them in the same way a systematic philosopher would, but they're both defining terms. So is Spengler kind of joking with himself that he doesn't know destiny? I don't know. I mean, that would be a very... very interesting tongue-in-cheek remark on his part. But I don't think he really has reflected on it. I just think it's a blatant contradiction, as we'll find throughout this work. But now, in his attempt to define culture, he's going to define it by what its relations are to visible history, to life, to soul, to nature, and to intellect. And then he's going to define also by how these forms may be accepted and pointed to as symbols. And this, again, is a very important thing for him. How much is any linguistic construction or anything, how much is its power as a symbol? For him, the power of symbolism is mystical, I think. But for him, the power of symbolism is tremendously important. And this is what separates an idea that has life force, that is alive, something with great symbolism, and a symbolism that is consonant with its prime symbol, the prime symbol of this high culture. For any idea to have life force, it must be some sort of instantiation of that prime symbol for Spengler. And then these forms that he mentions, are peoples, tongues and epochs, battles and ideas, states and gods, arts and craft works, sciences, laws, economic types, and world ideas, great men and great events. And this kind of goes back to my thinking that Atkinson didn't translate the title of Volume 1 very well, because now we're talking about forms, but these are really actualities, I believe. I mean, I think he's really talking about actualities in the sense of form and actuality. But in colloquial English, at least today, if we want to say form, we would mean more like the physical form. We would mean more the actuality. And we don't... And maybe it's just because there are fewer Platonists who know that they're Platonists, right? Because we've got all these dingbats walking around today who don't know anything about philosophy, but they are Neoplatonists and Neo-Marxists without actually understanding what they are. But, so that's, it's just, why is Atkinson translating into form and actuality? Maybe that is very clear for a 1920s English audience, because they're more well-versed in Plato and his idea of the Platonic forms in that realm away from here, and then they're just instantiated here as actualities, but they're not as perfect here as they would be in the world of forms. So, and this gets into the actual German title of it. So it's Umrisse einer Morphologie der Weltgeschichte. So it's contours or outlines, that's Umrisse. So the contours are the outlines of a morphology of world history. And that's probably a better, certainly that's the more literal translation. That's the more direct translation, the more faithful translation to what Spengler's actually said. Outlines of a morphology of world history. But maybe Atkinson doesn't think that gives the reader enough information. But it probably would be better to emphasize the morphology aspect than to emphasize the form and actuality aspect. Because the morphology, that's Spengler's method. That's actually what he's doing. The form and actuality is kind of a theoretical, philosophical process that's kind of put on top of things to... I don't know. To some degree, it's what's guiding his morphology. But at the same time, I just kind of disagree with the way that the title's been translated. So I'll say that much. And then I wonder, with all these different forms that he speaks of here, which I believe really are actualities in the sense of form and actuality, which, isn't helpful to have these words that are the same, form and form, and one can mean Platonic form, and the other can mean the instantiation of that Platonic form as an actuality. It's not conducive to understanding for an English speaker, so it's not very good. Anyway, so these different things that he calls forms here: peoples, tongues and epochs, battles and ideas, states and gods, arts and craft works, sciences, laws, economic types and world ideas, great men and great events. Are these actually all in the same category? Because I personally don't know. We could define them at a high enough level of generality and call them all things, or call them all processes or something. And yeah, maybe they all fit that. But I'm just not convinced that these really are all of the same category. So, who knows? Who knows? But those are things that I would be thinking about in looking at this part 1 of Oswald Spengler's introduction to Decline of the West. And yeah, so that's all I've got to say. He's setting up the stage for defining culture and defining his system, and we'll get into that further as we discuss part 2. Thanks very much for your time, and I hope you have a great day. Peace.